In 2009, a dog digs up some bones at New Mexico's West Mesa, which gives way to an investigation into what is thought to be a serial killer's graveyard. About 6 weeks later, a unit of the police department catches the news after a raid as Chief Carter informs the press about their findings. Deeming it an ongoing investigation, Carter mentions that they found the remains of 11 women and an unborn child. With further forensic reports, he says they hope to find the identities of these women as well as the circumstances of their tragic ends. He then tells detectives Paul Ortega and Laura Young about the mayor wishing to involve the FBI in the investigation. After picking up Agent Petrovic, who insists on being called Pete, Paul and Laura then take him over to the police department where he meets Chief Carter. Pete mentions working on a cold case regarding some missing indigenous girls from a while ago, which he believes does not have a connection with the serial killer case they have on their hands at the moment. Diving deeper into serial killers, he says that they could be categorized into one of 4 types. The visionaries are the ones who hear voices, the power control-oriented are into prolonged torture and usually keep trophies to gloat over, and the indulgent ones are into mutilation and more certainly on the psycho side of things than the others. Pete's experience tells him, however, that the one they are now seeking belongs to the final category, the mission-oriented killers, who truly believe that their work is contributing to transforming the world into a better place. Adding that the killer could be any religious person with a stable job and who has possibly lived around the area for most of their life, Pete comes across as confident about his abilities to arrive at the culprit. At lunch, Laura realizes that Paul is a bit prickly and wary about Pete being involved in the case. Later, she then overhears Paul's phone conversation while he mentions having sent a DNA sample for processing. Together, they then question a woman who had managed to escape a psychopathic killer named Caesar about 8 years ago. She recalls that she was forced to obey him while he held her at gunpoint. To her shock, however, she had discovered that the gun was not loaded when she had grabbed it and tried to take him down. All she could do then was run for her life. Upon being prodded further, she mentions Tate, an undercover dirty cop she knew back then. She also mentions a rumor doing the rounds about Tate regarding him having ended the life of a woman who was pregnant because of him. This woman, she says, could be the one whose remains were recently found. Knowing that Tate used to work in the narcotics department and was later suspended for misconduct before being reinstated, an intrigued Paul reports the information to Chief Carter and asks for permission to further look into his present activities. Chief Carter thinks back to what he knows about Tate and how he had observed as Tate questioned one of his accusers, Maria Orta. However, Maria had lost her cool when Tate had insinuated ill relations and proceeded to speak about her mother's immigration papers, which had resulted in her being led away and Tate being suspended. Tate had then taken an extended vacation after which he had been reinstated. At the local inn, meanwhile, Pete goes through the evidence while thinking back to 2004 when he had helped fix a flat tire on his daughter's car. The seemingly normal and peaceful situation had changed into a heated one with the arrival of one of his suspects who had begun firing at him. Returning the attack, Pete had managed to take him out but had realized too late that he had lost his daughter instead. Since then, Pete had been determined to find suspects as soon as it was possible before they could strike again. The next morning, Paul speaks to Candy about the missing girls, one among whom is his niece Selena. Reluctant to cooperate at first, Candy eventually informs Paul that one of her sisters, Flacca, went missing about a month before Selena. He tries to convince her to come down to the station for a statement, but to no avail. Nonetheless, he leaves his contact details with her for whenever she is ready to help further. Just then, they see a girl being unceremoniously dumped on the street before the guy drives away. While Paul chases him for a while before giving up, Caesar eventually makes his way to a convenience store where he scares a young female fellow shopper by offering her a ride. As he exits the store, both the store's owner and the young girl wonder about Caesar's weird behavior. When she leaves a while later, however, she doesn't notice Caesar watching her. Meanwhile, Paul receives a call from Candy, or rather, Naomi Harks, who informs him about being ready to help him. Excusing himself by saying that he is meeting a friend, Paul leaves Laura back at the office while he heads over to meet Naomi. In her statement, she mentions going to hotel rooms with Selena and China, where there would then be a party with narcotics. One such night, Selena had gone off on her own to presumably meet a guy, which was, Naomi says, the last time she ever saw her. Having recognized his car since he had worked up a reputation, Naomi realized that it was Tate who picked Selena up that night. She had tried calling her later but hadn't been able to get through. As it turns out, Selena had already passed by then and was being buried. Looking into the case, Paul finds that most of the girls who have gone missing over the past few years had eventually been arrested by Tate. Since this revelation leads to the possibility of a cop being a serial killer, Chief Carter insists Paul to be completely sure before taking any further action. Only waiting on DNA reports on the pregnant woman and her unborn kid, Paul is confident of nabbing Tate once he has sufficient evidence. Understanding a predatory killer, however, Pete expects him to strike again. Unbeknownst to him, his expectation is proven right, and yet another girl is buried in the boneyard. Meanwhile, Chief Carter is thinking back to when he was the leader of the SWAT team tasked with rescuing a bunch of abducted girls. Both sides had lost lives in the ensuing gunfight, but the team had eventually been successful in rescuing the girls. Elsewhere, Pete wonders about the similarities in the pain they all carry, what with Chief Carter having lost 2 men during the raid, Paul having lost Selena, and as for himself, he had failed to protect his daughter. 3 men who had lost in the past are now working together to put an end to the menace caused by a serial killer, which made this case a personal one for all of them. Following this realization, Pete brings in Agent Womack to meet the others on the case the next day, since the FBI already has an ongoing investigation into Tate regarding a trafficking ring. She mentions that things are more sinister than just Tate, thereby hinting at the involvement of more people, since she doesn't believe Tate is the killer they are hunting for. However, having made up his mind about Tate, Paul firmly believes that Tate is indeed the culprit. Despite being confronted by Laura about keeping her away from the investigation, Paul chooses to continue on his own. Meeting Tate later, Paul learns that Tate chose to transfer to the narcotics department after being reinstated to stay out of trouble. Refusing to believe him right away, Paul informs him about their investigation, which angers Tate as he continues to insist that he has been clean since the last time he messed up. Later that evening, Tate thinks back to the night he met Selena when he had asked her for a favor in return for an attempt at getting rid of the charges against her. While he had ensured that she wasn't doing anything she wasn't comfortable with, he still seems to be deeply disturbed by everything that had happened later that night. It is in this state of mind that his commanding officer, Sergeant Graham, finds him and sternly reprimands him for being involved in a murder case. The next morning, Paul meets his sister and Selena's mother, Nina. Curious about Paul's behavior, Laura observes from afar. Once inside the house, Nina tells her brother about Selena hanging out with a few shady people before she went missing. Insisting that none of what happened is Nina's fault, Paul assures his sister that he will find Selena. Elsewhere, an FBI unit headed by Agent Womack works on narrowing down the list of suspects. Pete suggests looking for the person who seems to be hiding in plain sight, instead of the one who seems the obvious choice that stands out. In town, meanwhile, another woman loses her life and is soon buried in the boneyard. In his childhood neighborhood the next day, Paul meets the guy that Selena was known to live with for a while. It is from him that he learns that she had been kicked out the day she was caught stealing money, and that she had not been seen since then. He is then told something that he already knows. Selena's only option on the streets was to be picked up by traffickers. Leaving work later, Laura catches up with Graham. Hearing that Paul was keeping things from her, Graham offers to conduct an investigation of their own before he meets his family for dinner. Later that night, he receives a mysterious call during which he talks about his preparedness to break department rules in return for assurance that his team would be taken care of. Meanwhile, the serial killer adds another female to his tally in the boneyard. Graham meets Paul at work the next morning to assure him that even if Tate is guilty, none of his team is involved with his activities. Later, Graham hands over a file on Paul to Laura. Meanwhile, Pete is in a meeting with the convenience store's owner, who insists on having seen most of the victims of the boneyard. Voicing his doubts about Caesar, he informs Pete about last week's incident at the store. Laura, on the other hand, goes over to meet Nina. With Nina's back to her, Laura discreetly takes a couple of pictures of the photos on her fridge. Elsewhere, Sergeant Graham leads a raid into a narcotics operation. He then offers to help its leader, Pablo Ruiz, in return for a favor. This favor turns out to be pushing the blame for the boneyard on Tate in the form of volunteering information, as Paul figures out once Chief Carter informs him about the arrest. Having enough grounds for an arrest warrant now, Paul brings Tate in. While Tate continues to insist on his innocence, he is shown a necklace recovered from one of the corpses. He is left alone once he asks for a lawyer, even as Chief Carter appreciates Paul for building up a circumstantial case. However, he also warns against getting too excited, since they don't really have any evidence incriminating Tate yet. A while later, Paul sadly learns that the DNA samples he had sent in for testing have matched with Selena. Additionally, Chief Carter lets him know that the DNA of the pregnant woman's child does not match Tate's. With no reason to keep him in anymore, Tate is allowed to leave. Later, Pete meets everyone to inform them about having narrowed down their list of suspects to a singular name, Cesar Monto. While Paul recognizes him from the day he first spoke to Naomi, Womack mentions 2 agents staking out Caesar's place. Speaking privately with Chief Carter, Laura lets him know that one of the victims, Selena, is Paul's niece. Meanwhile, Womack learns more about Caesar during a questioning with Nella, who had met him one night. When she heard that Caesar had recently lost his mother, Nella had tried to comfort him. However, he had then recited something about stopping all sin before he had attacked her. Just then, Tate had showed up and Nella was saved from a terrible fate. Chief Carter, meanwhile, reassigns Paul to another case before telling him about Nella's statement regarding Caesar. Confident that Graham needs something to stay hidden, Paul reiterates his belief about Tate being the culprit. Detective Balog seeks out Graham, meanwhile, and states putting an end to his operation since he hasn't been able to control Tate. He also adds that they won't be covering for him anymore, implying that there isn't anyone to stop internal affairs from looking into him. Meanwhile, Caesar packs up yet another victim to be buried in the boneyard. This time, however, he is followed by the agents stationed outside his house. Paul, on the other hand, is following Tate till he eventually meets a woman. Recognizing Paul's car, Tate quickly gets on his way. Strongly believing that Tate is guilty, Paul bumps into his car, which leads to an accident. Compelled to think back to his time with Selena, Tate remembers having dropped her off that night, free to be picked up by another a while later. Meanwhile, Caesar finally faces the consequences of his cleansing spree when he is surrounded by cops. As he tries to run, Pete shoots at him before placing him under arrest. The next morning, Chief Carter listens to Tate's voice recording that blames Graham. Paul explains that Graham has been using the power of the badge to scare witnesses into giving false statements. Following this revelation, Paul then proceeds to arrest Graham for official misconduct and criminal coercion. In a meeting later, Womack announces that Caesar's DNA doesn't match the one found on the boneyard victims, implying that the killer is still roaming free. While Paul informs Nina about Selena's fate, a determined Pete continues to study the evidence in the hopes of finding the culprit. A month later, Paul learns about the discovery of yet another boneyard adjacent to the earlier one.